In the early 1970s, in Murphysboro, Illinois, the town was terrorized by a creature that came out of a local river called the Big Muddy. This river gave the creature its name, the Big Muddy Monster. But what we found is the sightings go back much further than the 1970s.
For over 100 years, people have been seeing some giant, 8-foot tall, 400-pound Bigfoot-looking creature. Sightings date back in 1942. There was a flap of sightings in the region, so terrifying that newspapers warned children not to go into the woods by themselves. Livestock were found devoured and ripped apart by a creature they were calling the Thing. These sightings continued into the 1950s. In 1960s, 1968, another creature appeared, 10 foot tall. They called it the What's It, terrifying people in the region. And in the 1970s, the area was a hotbed of paranormal activity. You had curious sight seekers coming, you had amateur hunters here, you had noted cryptozoologist Lauren Coleman here, Jerome Clark wrote about it, and the stories continue.
They continued into the 80s with another sighting in Murphysboro. At this time it was at a scrapyard where it was screaming and pounding on steel sheds and things. And the sightings continue all the way up until today. In fact, the town has embraced the legend. Today they have a festival celebrating the creature.
And this is our investigation into that mystery. Well, what I find so puzzling about this case is that you have these big flaps of sightings, maybe 24 people in a small time frame, and then it can go years or decades without anyone seeing it or reporting it at all. Mm-hmm. Like, where's this thing going? What's it doing if it's here in the first place? You know, here in flesh and blood type plot. Just, you would think if it's reported in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, but there are big gaps. Is it migrating?
Yeah, like what's it doing in those interim periods? You know, is it a cave dwelling thing where it's staying there unless something forces it out, or is there something, you know, stranger at work here?
And then you have the discrepancies in the size, which is granted. People are going to see it from different angles. People are going to see it different times of the year, but also in color. Like in the 68 sighting, you had a 10-foot black monster.
Yeah, some of the more recent ones are described as being very dark brown and black as well.
But it's not uncommon for animals to have a winter and summer coat.
Yeah.
Different coloration.
Or it could be an age factor. I mean, I'm not suggesting that this thing's 100 years old, but, you know, if it is a breeding population, you know, eventually they become perhaps silver in color, whitish as they age. There's a possibility maybe the younger ones are more brown or black.
So this is the site of the old Murphysboro Iron and Metal Company. Back in the 1940s, this was plagued with creature sightings. Workers were terrified of this monster roaming through along the old railroad tracks. Finally, in 1949, the owner, fearing that nobody wanted to work here, offered a $100 reward for the creature. The only problem was nobody could agree as to what the creature looked like. Some say it looked like a wolf with a bushier tail. Some say it was smaller than a fox. Some said it had a dog's face, but it wasn't a dog. Others reported it was a bear that would walk upright on its hind legs. Unfortunately, we will never know because the reward was never claimed and the creature was never captured.
So getting to the campsite was a little bit of an adventure in itself. You know, I don't know how many miles of winding roads and valleys to get back into here, but I mean, we both know that this is one of the places where the creature's been spotted over the years, which is why we're staying here. But this is a pretty remote spot. I mean, we've got a pond behind us. It's nothing but darkness.
And a lot of what we do know about the Big Muddy Monster is that a lot of the sightings were at night.
Yep.
So it seems to be nocturnal. It likes water close by, which we have
here, hopefully. It's a draw.
And it's not innately scared of people. It seems to be more curious than anything.
Yeah.
All the witnesses we talked to say that they didn't feel like it was going to harm them outside of the couple that was at the Riverside Park at the boat landing.
As we both know, truckers, they're great observers of the different phenomena because they're on the road all the time. And that's what I think makes this such a cool sighting of truck drivers.
I would agree entirely. They're out in the sticks, they're out at night when most people aren't, it's just more eyes on the road.
So in 1975, several truckers right up on the road independently radioed in on their CBs of seeing some giant creature that seemed to resemble a gorilla. And that's interesting too, because you would think if you're driving and you catch something big, the size they say it was or is, the first thing you'd think of is a bear.
Yeah, for sure.
Because that's the most likely explanation, but that's not what they're reporting. They're reporting more of a gorilla look.
I thought that was strange too. And along that same stretch of road, it keeps happening too. It wasn't just a one-off. So as recently as 2011, someone saw what they thought was a Bigfoot along that same stretch of road. And then the next year, they saw it again. Only this time it was two that they described as possibly a male and a female standing by the tree line. And as they passed, they kind of stepped back into the trees.
Interesting. Was the 2011 by the railroad track?
Yes.
And again, that fits in with the whole Big Muddy Monster along the rails of the old iron company and metal company had the railroad there, and other creatures from the Van Meter Visitor to the Enfield Horror, all along these railroad lines. So
exactly.
Big Muddy, we think, travels the Big Muddy River, obviously, but a lot of these creatures seem to follow the old railroad trails.
I mean, it makes sense. It's an easy way to get around, rather than just going through the brush and trees.
Yeah, and a lot of it's on the outskirts of town where people aren't usually walking. It's too dangerous, so it's free of pedestrians, so likely not being seen.
Exactly.
Very interesting case.
So when I don't know if you remember the original cast very well. Was it basically this exact shape too? I mean, because
of course it was. Yeah, it was that. I mean, it had you could physically see the toe imprint, but it did. I mean, yeah, it was. To me, I think this part might have been a little less wide. Maybe that was from the stamping of it. I'm not sure, but yeah, for the most part, it was just this. Yeah, the toes were,
So they took that original plaster cast, pressed it into this concrete material to make something a lot more durable that'll last longer. Obviously, it's lasted 40 years. And what you can kind of see from what we've been determining is, the toes are very splayed, and they're kind of spread out, which kind of gives the impression that when the print was made, that there might have been some sliding in the mud a little bit, to kind of give it that irregular shape in the toes. Do you recall if the original cast had any kind of details in the foot, like any kind of like ridges?
Yeah, I do recall the, I don't know what you call that, but
the technical term is dermal ridges that are in like a hand or a foot.
Yeah, I don't know. I remember it, but I don't, with it being plaster and kind of porous, I'm not really sure. I mean, you can see this where it comes up. What do they call that?
like the arch of the foot.
Yeah. I mean, you could see that in the cast, you could actually see, how that was.
So this cast is roughly about, say, 13 inches, from toe to heel, which is a little bit on the smaller side for a lot of Bigfoot prints that people typically find. So do you think that perhaps this was a juvenile or a female? Like when the creature was seen, was there any clues to give away any kind of gender?
No. And I wouldn't even know. I mean, that was never discussed, so I wouldn't know. I just knew it was a Bigfoot that Grandma saw, so.
It's big either way.
Did you guys go over this? Was there more? I think you told me, but were there other footprints and were there other casts? Or is this like the best one they found?
I don't think there were any other.
Earlier we were talking that Chad and I had heard rumors that someone else had made a cast that was on display at a bar not too far from where she lives that was there for a long time. They also had a giant snapping turtle that they had on it.
Mall held it was a family restaurant.
Right.
Yeah.
And we'd heard that a Cub Scout or Boy Scout team had made that one too. We don't know if it was made from the same impression or if it was the same Boy Scout. I assume it's the same Boy Scouts.
Yeah.
But we don't know what happened to that print.
Yeah.
And it's, from what we know, that one's just a rumor.
Okay.
So, as you're aware, the Shawnee National Forest is almost 300,000 acres. It's a vast chunk of land. So it's all swamps and hills and forest. So it's conceivable that an area of land could hide something of even as big as a Bigfoot that they say is 7 feet tall in this land. Do you think that that's conceivable to you, or?
I could see that. There's plenty of resources for an animal to survive. I mean, there's other animals, there's lots of wild vegetation, I could see it. I could see it happening.
And some of the areas are pretty impenetrable, like down in the scatters, it's hard to get back in there.
Yes, and even the deer hunters have problems getting into places, and it's there's lots of places it's not accessible to humans, I would say.
Yeah, a lot of places to hide.
Oh, yes. Yes, lots of places to hide.
But the size of it seemed to frighten them, but when everyone else sees it, it seems to be just as curious about them as they are of it.
Exactly. I mean, the teenagers described it as, it almost acted like a peeping Tom almost, like it's very curious. And with the carnies, it was interested in the ponies. So it seems like a very curious creature. It's not there to, menace people, but it just wants to know what's going on. Because this is its territory.
And so much of it does point to flesh and blood, that it leaves footprints, that it seems to be affected by the river mud on it. But then other parts of it throw it out there as not being flesh and blood, that there's no fur left behind, there's no scat, there's no other physical evidence.
Right. Along the physical line too, Murphysboro is known for apple orchards and things like that. We both know that a lot of Bigfoot sightings happen along areas where there's a lot of fruit trees or the ripening of blackberries, things like that, where there's going to be a natural food source to attract them.
I'm not entirely sure that I think it's even what you would think a Bigfoot creature or a Sasquatch. On general view, yes, it's the same size and dimensions, 7 feet tall, but anything that tall gets lumped in that category. And the weight, but a lot of the witnesses describe its head being more cone-shaped, and its ears like floppy and furry and big. Characteristics, at least in the physical part, that you don't see in many other traditional Bigfoot or Sasquatch sightings.
Yeah, there was that one drawing from the 70s that showed it with almost tall, pointed ears, which is highly unusual.
And Bob, when he had his junkyard sighting, he said the same thing. His head was like really oddly shaped, and the ears and the glowing eyes, which again pushes it over into that not flesh and blood. Not a lot of creatures that I know of prowling Illinois with glowing red eyes, and not a reflection of light or a light shine, but emanating.
Exactly. Like people never describe it as eye shine like you'd see with deer or other nighttime animals. It's always portrayed as a source of light itself, actual glowing eyes, which of course nothing in nature that we know does that. So it makes it far stranger.
I'm also curious that although a lot of the witnesses said that they didn't feel intimidated or threatened by this thing, that back in the 40s and 50s, a lot of livestock and dogs were found mauled. And the brains were eaten and the blood drained out of it and left behind discarded, but they were just tore apart. So if it is the same creature, it seems to know the difference between what it can get away with taking and eating and what it cannot.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's killing dozens of people and tearing them apart and they're finding their discarded, mauled bodies, there's going to be a bigger search. So it seems to indicate some intelligence there. And Bob mentioned that as well when he was trying with the security guard to lure it back to the garage under the security light, the motion light. He said he felt like it purposely went around, like it knew that they were setting the trap for it.
Yeah, it implies a certain degree of intelligence or cunning that it knows its boundaries, basically.
And then how do we explain the fact that trained police officers, trained tracking dogs, cannot follow this thing? That you got the entire police force in Murphysboro out to the Westwood Lane suburb complex, and they can't find this thing. They can't track it. The dog tracks it, refuses to go in. But again, if it was flesh and blood, you would think it would be easily captured. I think some of the anomalies of this case, from the glowing red eyes to witnesses saying it had a steering wheel-sized head, really set it apart from other cryptids.
I would agree. I mean, number one, it's white, which is unusual for Bigfoot cases. And in some cases, they even describe it as having pointed ears. So what is this thing?
Yeah, and the junkyard sighting where it's the coned head. And that's the hard part as researchers over years going back and forth. You get some evidence that points it one way and then completely the opposite.
Exactly. So what's interesting about the Big Muddy Monster is it's one big piece in a larger puzzle of southern Illinois. There's all kinds of weird things going on down there. You know, whether it's spook lights, the Enfield horror, all kinds of weird things going on.
I really hope that these legends will continue on forever, that it only gets weirder and stranger, and maybe we'll find out what it is, we'll prove it or disprove it, but for me, the adventure, the travel, the people we met, the witnesses we spoke with, it's not a bad second prize.
Definitely.